that what he presents is something that can be a way out for everybody. But I guess the suggestion is whether everybody is capable of hearing that.
Welcome to Totally Pretentious, a podcast about great movies. I'm Sean.
And I'm David.
And on today's show, we'll discuss Space is the Place, produced in 1972 and released in 1974, written by Sun Ra and Joshua Smith, directed by John Coney, and starring Sun Ra as himself, or not himself, who knows, Raymond Johnson as the Overseer, Christopher Brooks as Jimmy Fay, and some others, which you can look up on IMDb if you are at all curious.
But before we get started, a friendly reminder that we want to hear from you. You can share your comments with us about this and past episodes at skiffyandfanty.com/listener-suggestions. We want to put together a listener mailbag episode with your thoughts, questions, topic suggestions, and more, so please get those thoughts in.
Do it or else. David will tuckerize you in a book and you'll die a horrible death. Or I guess I should do it the other way because that's normally how that's done. But whatever. So On to Space is the Place. So we did want to have a guest on for this, but we're unable to make that work. Such is life. However, if you are interested in Black scholarship on Afrofuturism and Sun Ra, we do strongly recommend that you check out two particular books. There are many others that you might want to check out. Afrofuturism, The World of Black Sci-Fi and Fantasy Culture by Ytasha L. Womack, and Afrofuturism Rising, The Literary Prehistory of the Movement by Isaiah Lavender III. Both of those are fantastic works, and they may lead you to some others if you're at all curious, so please do check those out.
And we'll have the links up for those on the show notes.
Exactly. Yeah, we will have those links up. So I guess the big thing I should do is we should try to explain what this movie's about. Because it's a little bit complex, I would say, David. I don't know if you would agree, but it's sort of like trying to explain Lisa and the Devil.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly some of the narrative strategies that reminded me of some of the things that I really enjoy, and I have to thank you for picking this film. I loved it, and this is completely new to me, and I really, really, really enjoyed this. Trying to give a very strict linear description of this would be a little bit like describing a dream, but hey, it's your movie, so you go for it.
Right. Well, I will just note that this film sort of takes place at three different times, and I will just note that this film's conception of time is going to break your brain, and that's because it literally at one point just says that time is we are beyond time now, that we are existing in another place. It's one of the lines that has said that. But basically, it takes place in 1943 Chicago. It takes place in what is contemporary, quote-unquote, 1969 Chicago. But it also features some allusions to ancient times, but also space and outer space. There's references to 2000, etc. But the basic idea is that Sun Ra is a space traveler from beyond the Earth who comes to the Earth to bring his music with the hope of essentially liberating the black race from the current fate offered to them in the United States of America. He eventually takes on the role of Sonny Ray in a 1943 Chicago strip club, where he meets with a figure by the name of the Overseer, played by Ray Johnson, who is a sort of pimp / overlord / maybe devil-like figure, and together they basically have a game of cards to determine the fate of black people in the United States, or at least that is nominally what we get. The film from that point on follows Ra as he spends time in modern-day Oakland and deals with a number of disaffected youths. He is possibly being hunted by the FBI / NASA, who attempt to assassinate him. He's offering all of this stuff. He opens this employment agency. He's bringing his music in his relationship with Jimmy Fay, who is a radio show host, and the story kind of freeform flows between music and snippets of life in Oakland, dealing with race relations, dealing with prostitution and drugs and other kinds of things that are affecting lives in that area, until the ending of the film, which involves Ra possibly winning the argument with the overseer by leaving the earth under the guise that the earth just wants to talk about real things, but he is the living embodiment of myth, and he takes with him a number of the figures we see throughout the story who basically are liberated and get to go to this music planet that we see at the very beginning. That description is not very good, and I just want to note because this film has a lot in it. And again, trying to describe it is incredibly difficult. But there's lots of music. There is a lot of very overt social and political and racial commentary. There are some interesting vignettes which talk about some of the problems in U.S. culture, specifically Oakland is the central space where we get most of this. And there is some just fantastic and really unusual dialogue throughout.
Yeah, all of that being very true. And I think, any attempt, like we said, trying to summarize this film is going to be difficult. But I think you hit on a lot of the things that are happening in it, and I think important to point out that it is unfolding in a non-linear fashion, right? So that's going to challenge any kind of straightforward description. But I think the flip side of that is it can sound confusing described, but it isn't experienced.
Yeah, I think this goes to... So for those that don't know who Sun Ra is, and some of our listeners might not know who Sun Ra is, he was a musician who engaged in free jazz and incorporated rag and blues and traditional jazz and a number of other genres, and had a very avant-garde style of musical production. And that not only presents itself here in the soundtrack, and in some choices for specific sounds that are given to specific characters or moments, but it also shows in the structure of the film itself. I like to describe Sun Ra as a musical cacophony, and I think that this film could be kind of described as a film cacophony, that there's a lot going on, and if you try to make sense of anything in a linear sense, it just falls apart. But if you're thinking about it as a broad piece of film philosophy, I think you start to make sense of what it's trying to do, at least for the most part.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm not going to make any kind of pretense to being any sort of jazz expert because I really, really am not. It's not a form of music that I'm particularly familiar with. But I think the way you described it there, the way that it plays out in the film, that both the structure of the film and the structure of the music are very closely matched. When I was watching this, I was sort of feeling, I mean, because this was very new to me, both as a film, as the Sun Ra as a musician, it was really hitting this cold, and so it was a delightful revelation to me, and so I found myself kind of reaching out for what are some of the things this reminds me of, points of reference that actually I shouldn't say that I was reaching out for them, they were just popping into my mind as sort of this feels a little bit like something I've encountered here, and I want to be careful here because I don't want to say it's drawing upon these influences, because I don't know that it is, and I don't want to suggest that either. It's just the resonances that went off in my head, right? So the whole form of the film and the use of jazz there, just to go back to filmmakers that we've talked about before, that certainly put me in mind of Jess Franco's late 60s, early 70s work in particular. I was seeing bits of The Seventh Seal, there's El Topo, but without being anywhere nearly as annoying as that film. These examples of philosophical works, of film that is very much a movie of ideas rather than a straightforward narrative. But for all that, these were things that were echoing for me intertextually in the film. It was also the excitement of seeing this. This was a movie that was very much its own thing, with a very, very distinct voice and way of telling the story. I'm not even sure if I'm using the right word there, story, but I found it a very exciting thing to watch, because I mean I had no idea what the next scene was going to be in any description, and yet I had no trouble just being transported by this very raw and extremely vital collision of images, or even a cataract of images, as we careened around the world of its narrative.
Yeah, from a film influence perspective, I think it's pretty interesting because it's very clear that this is riffing on and also responding to what was a major film moment, which was the blaxploitation period.
Yes.
And you see definite allusions here. And there are some specifics that I'm not familiar enough with the period that I can name the films off the top of my head, but a number of scholars have noted very explicit references perhaps being made here, or at least heavily implied ones, if not very explicit. And so there's blaxploitation tropes that are present that are being challenged by the figure of Sun Ra. I will also note that critics want us to separate real Ra from film Ra. And given that Sun Ra basically wrote almost all of his dialogue for this film and also had such a dramatic impact on the editing of the film, I don't know that the real and film Ra are as separate entities as some critics might want us to think. That in some way this film is kind of a version of Sun Ra. And that shows in just not just the filmic style, which very much feeds into his music. It does not just in terms of the music, which is explicit and present here, and is very much Sun Ra style music. It is very unique, but it also shows up in the philosophy of this film. And I think if you come into it really, really cold, you're going to catch a lot of interesting allusions, but you might miss the fact that apparently Sun Ra read this book called the Urantia book, which I know almost nothing about. It's this 2,000 page philosophy, religion, quote unquote science book, which includes all of these interesting explanations of the nature of the universe, incorporates biblical teachings, and creates this really different way of thinking about the world that includes the belief that there is a celestial musician who will appear on Earth and change the world, which hey, look at this film. It's precisely what we get in this film. And so there is just a lot here that are clearly references for Ra, not just in his own work external from this film, but also within the film itself in terms of his responses, but also things that he brings in. I mean, the thing that I think you'll have noticed, David, was the amount of Neo-Egyptian aesthetics that is present. That's also a Sun Ra thing that's present throughout his work as well. If you look at videos of his performances, he brings an enormous amount of Egyptian and other African cultures into his music and performances, that, everything from the dress to some of the musical expectations and stylings, and some of that is here. There are a lot of African drums throughout the soundtrack of this, which I think is really cool. So this film is incredibly referential, but it also has a lot of really interesting things to say about what are clearly its primary concerns, which is the state of Black Americans or Black people in America. Obviously focused in this case on Oakland, but can include more broadly, which I think this film makes some very strong positions on. The most notable, I think, is the moment in the story when Sun Ra's character goes into a room of young Black people and basically says to them, you can't really know that I'm real because I'm a myth, but so are you, because you're already not fully included in the category of human by definition of being Black. So you are a myth as I am a myth. And this is where you get the I'm the living embodiment of myth idea. He says literally, I come to you as the myth because that's what's Black.
And an ending very interestingly with his final speech saying how you don't want to talk about us because we are a myth. Well, this is the myth speaking to you, or words to that effect.
Yeah.
Which felt like a really a strong, a powerful conclusion to that idea developed there. Mm-hmm. And what you were saying about the blaxploitation film aspects, I mean, yeah, definitely it's there. And at the same time, I guess I'm struck because this is still, so this is made in 1972, so this is pretty early on in that, right? It's only the year before that you get Sweet Sweetback's Badass Song and Shaft, and we get that's where that kicks off the explosion. Superfly comes out also in 1972, but which you could kind of see the Overseer as some of that iconography. But the thing is, I don't think I was just checking the dates, and I don't think that this could have been influenced in the making of it by that. But though I see, I guess what I did connect to was some aspects of Sweet Sweetback's Badass Song with that same sort of films that are clearly there's not a lot of money behind this, but there is enormous creativity, and the lack of finances seem completely irrelevant to the power of the images on screen. In fact, that almost seems to give it an added urgency. But there's I guess, the sense of both films certainly playing by their own rules, not by any kind of conventional sense of how a movie is supposed to work. Right, so we are seeing it's fitting that it's another movie coming from this period of certainly of American cinema, its second golden age, but with voices that wouldn't have been heard, at least very or have had much of a chance of being heard in the past, now demanding to be heard, and demanding to tell the stories in the way that they want, that they feel, or that they want to, or the way the stories need to be told.
I think that's interesting that you bring that up, because this film, part of the problem that we ran into in watching this film is that it is not that available. And that has historically been the case. It has had a couple of releases on various forms of media, but when it was released, it had a short run, and then it mostly disappeared. And then Sun Ra did a number of concerts under the name Space is the Place, which included extended cuts of some of the music from this film, where he performed them. But the film itself basically kind of semi-disappeared. One of the concerns that we had, David and I, is that this is not currently available in anywhere but on the Criterion, or was at least on the Criterion channel, the subscription service. And so if you don't have access to that wherever you are, you have to find a DVD somewhere. And DVDs aren't cheap for this. I paid $50 for my DVD because I just really wanted this to be in my collection. And so I think it's interesting you bring that up, of like, there's this urgency to be heard. And I think you're right. This film has a strong urgency that the message it is offering should be heard. And yet it is in some ways not been heard outside of a specific community communicating about it. Because again, Sun Ra has been considered to some degree one of the sort of fathers or grandfathers of Afrofuturism, a term that he never necessarily took on himself, but which others have attached to him because of his influence.
So yeah, that's a good point. So when I was comparing it a few moments ago to Sweetback, in that, I mean, completely different movies in terms of the stories that they're telling. I mean, there's some in their attention to the problems in their communities. There's a definite overlap, but there are certainly there aren't any spaceships or planets exploding in Sweetback. But as well, there's a significant difference. Like you said, that this film has been struggling with obscurity, whereas Sweetback was a gigantic success.
Yeah, to the point even, didn't they just have like a film about the making of that film?
Yeah, you know what, Badass, which it's funny, that was one of the films I was thinking about as for next time. So we'll maybe put that on the back burner for another time. But since you've mentioned that, I would highly recommend Badass, because this is so that's Mario Van Peebles' biopic about his father, Melvin Van Peebles, making the film. Mario plays Melvin, and it's very much about the relationship of the father and son, and it's an unblinking look at his father and the obsession that drove him to make that film. And it's a very very sharp look at that period, the social political context that led to the making of the film, and that was surrounded the making of the film, that everything that they were up against. So yeah, I mean, well, I can hardly not recommend it, since I teach it just about every year, but it's a really, really compelling look at the birth of that particular voice, that form of black cinema, and that very crucial film. So yeah, close parenthesis.
Yeah, so I think it's interesting that this is a film that people talk about, but yet is not as well known as I think we both would agree it should be. And part of the reason that I would argue that this film needs to be more important than it is and should be more readily available is in large part because of what the film's central messaging seems to be. There's all of this interesting stuff in here, right? There's clearly a play on the sort of God and the devil making bets and they're playing a card game, in this sort of detached sequence that's in like a desert which is between Sun Ra and the Overseer, and there's a kind of interplay of a sort of devil slash angel sort of component there, all of which is being centered on this idea of where Black people fit within a society, and more importantly about Sun Ra's efforts to bring them with him to this planet that we're introduced in the beginning, where the music is different, the sounds vibrate differently. He notes there's even this creature wearing this mirror face that exists there. And there's all of this interesting interplay that this is what's being suggested. And there's this great line at the beginning, which is something to the effect of, we should start a colony of Black people here in order to take them out of under the umbrella of whiteness and to see what they would essentially do. And in the end, that is interesting because it is not explicitly Black people that he necessarily takes with him. In one of the cut scenes, I will just note that one of the scenes that was cut from the film, they actually originally intended to have him also take a group of white people with him, but he says that they basically said that the NAACP would be too pissed off at them if they did that. And so there is a clear implication that what he is offering is an escape from a specific conception of whiteness that affects everybody that exists underneath its umbrella. I think that is enormously compelling as a film, and is something that honestly not a lot of films that deal with racial issues have ever addressed and thought about. Like, what does a world without the conceptions of race actually look like? Or what is a philosophy that is meant to get us to that point where we might begin to imagine that? Most films that deal with racial issues are dealing with, like, racism is a thing that exists and it is horrible and terrible, and we're going to show you that it's horrible and terrible, and we'll show you people fighting it. But we won't necessarily have a philosophical conversation about what is the end point, which this film seems to be trying to address by way of dealing with the different aspects of the Black community, which I would argue, and I don't know if you agree, David, seems to be in this film to be tearing itself apart, in part because of figures like the Overseer, but also through drugs and crime and delinquency and other kinds of things that are stripping the community of its cohesion, of its ability to exist as a functioning community.
Which does seem to be, though, certainly a product of white supremacy, right? That particular system that he's providing a way out from, or the possibility of a way out from, but that certainly lies in the background. Even if we only see it, explicitly manifested in a couple of those characters, right? The NASA FBI guys, or whoever they are. It's certainly, I think, the people who leave with him in the spaceship is certainly an explicitly Black population, but he does certainly mention the idea that what he presents is something that can be a way out for everybody. But I guess the suggestion is whether everybody is capable of hearing that. And the conclusion almost seems like it makes me think of the Day the Earth Stood Still, which ends with Michael Rennie's character Klaatu telling humanity, basically, get your act together, or you're going to be annihilated by us, if not yourselves, because you're now going to be a danger to everyone else. And so, live in peace or die in pieces, I think, is the way that's been summarized. We will await your answer. Is the end of that film. Whereas here, there's some of that same thing, right? As we see the spaceship leave, and we hear on the soundtrack, we're waiting to hear from you, waiting to talk from you. But then the images we see on Earth are of utter catastrophe, ending with the planet exploding. So there's the possibility of salvation that is offered, but a distinct sense that it's not going to be taken.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that, because that is one of the things, right, that we see what it may be implied to be the Earth has been exploded, and it's not specified what exactly has done it, but it is interesting that the finale of this film, after so many interesting sequences, does seem to suggest that this offer is open as long as you abandon the conceptions of race, and more particularly conceptions of race as conceived under white supremacy, because the people that are left behind are the NASA assassin FBI guys. They're like, it's very strange. They're like the FBI, but they're also NASA spies, and so they work for NASA, but they're the FBI, and they try to assassinate him. They get left behind, but that's because they're presented to us as both massively violent men who attempt to utilize the services of several of the sex workers, the two sex workers who do get dialogue in this film, and they are unable to perform and then get
who are also nurses.
Who are also nurses. Yes, they're sexy nurses because sure. And so they're unable to perform with these two women. They're insulted by the women, and then they come back, and one of them beats one of them almost to death. Really quite a violent scene. It's a lot of slapping, a lot of hitting. There's those two guys. They're not allowed to go. The white sex worker does not go, because at the very end, when Jimmy Faye, and we'll come back to Jimmy Faye, when he comes into the room, she basically yells at the overseer and calls him a slur. He calls him a slur and says, like, get his nasty blank hands off of her. And then she leaves with Jimmy Faye. But Jimmy Faye also is technically white at this moment in the respect of being within the frame of white supremacy, because one of the things that he does is he's trying to make sure that Sun Ra can get a record deal, essentially, to become famous as a record deal. This is one of these like little things that the youth get upset about because they think he's sold out, which is a part of the story. And there's a lot of question of, did Sun Ra sell out, or is he actually here to help people? In any case, Jimmy Faye at the very end, right, he says this thing where it's like, well, I could try to make this work, and all that Sun Ra gives is this idea that, I'll do what my ancestors have always done, which is that you won't necessarily like the answer that we give. And he just says, I'll take my chances. And he starts to walk away, and Sun Ra says, no. The black part of you I will take with me. The white part can stay here. And we see, and I think in my first viewing that you and I, David, were talking about, I didn't quite catch this, but the implication is that two versions of Jimmy Faye now are created. One goes on the ship, and one goes his own direction, and that one has now been essentially the white version of him, the person that is rooted within white supremacy. And he also says some slurs at the overseer, and he's left behind as well, right? He doesn't get to come. And so all the people that are left behind are people rooted within the systems of white supremacy, including the overseer, and not people that are not rooted, which is, I think it's important that one of the scenes that they really wanted to do but didn't do for fear of being hounded out of misery is to have also some white people as a part of this, because I think that the vision that's meant to be offered at the end here is not one that says we're only creating a Pan-African future where only black people exist in its own space, but rather to say, no, the thing we're uprooting is a specific form of whiteness that also affects people who are white. It affects them differently. It's not the same thing, but it does affect them. And so by getting rid of that system, we create a world where race doesn't matter. And so in stripping the blackness out of Jimmy Faye, part of, I think, what the end of this film is trying to suggest to us is that what ultimately needs to die are these notions of these racial categories as defined feature. And this go back to that line, right? This notion of I am the living embodiment of myth, because the concept of blackness is inherently a thing that doesn't exist, but yet also is being used in order to separate and split everybody and hold people back to oppress. But that affects not just them. It affects sex workers. It affects all these different groups of people. It affects entire communities. And so by uprooting it, you create a future, or you create a world or a space. Space is the place, as it were, where that system is gone, and we can imagine a world differently.
I think at least for me, I didn't need to see any white people in that ship as it left. I think the points that the film was making, some of which I think you're outlining there, come through very, very clearly. And I think too, I mean, his audiences for the performances we see are much more multicultural. But rather than, you're right. We see that the effect of white supremacy, how it impacts everyone else. All these other groups as well. But that it's just like in Get Out, where I think it was important that film not give us the good white guy, and I similarly didn't feel the need for that kind of equivalent or parallel aspect here either. The final moment where we are told, so we are going, you can choose to leave this thing if you want to, but it looks like you probably won't. So in some ways, it seems to be, I think, maybe both, the things, what you're saying there, that there's a utopian moment there, but also a very bleak one as well.
Yeah.
Recognizing how entrenched that system is and how unlikely there's going to be a map, at least for the people who are benefiting from it.
But also, maybe I'm wrong. That's my interpretation of what I'm seeing going on. Maybe I am full of shit, because I'm not Sun Ra, so who knows what he was thinking.
Well, and similarly, I want to be very cautious. I certainly don't want to sound in any way definitive myself either. It's a movie that I know that I'm still grappling with. What it was showing me, how it was showing me this, the way all the ideas were coming together and colliding, and that I'll find myself thinking about for a long time to come. And yeah, I certainly don't want to make any kind of pretense expertise. Good God, on this one, nor a sense of oh, okay, that's what happened, any more than I would with 2001: A Space Odyssey.
Yeah, I think that's fair too, right? That on some level, this film also leaves open a lot of room for different interpretations. Maybe I should take a little bit more care here to say that how I'm interpreting it could possibly also change with future rewatchings, that I think maybe the idea of a stable interpretation of this film is already a terrible idea, because it is contradictory at times. It is a film that flits back and forth between ideas and explores ideas in different ways. The opening is very different from the ending in terms of its the way that it philosophically handles the themes of race, but it also has like very overt things. Like, I don't know if you notice what the like FBI NASA guys torture Sun Ra with in the earphones.
Yes, I did. Yes.
So when I first heard it, I have to thank Jeff Zillin for this, because I knew the song, but I couldn't remember what the name was and what its history was. And so my first thought was like, oh, it's some like Philip Sousa stuff, right? And so it's very like American patriotic music, because it's kind of a march. And then no, it turns out it's Dixie. And that has that changes the nationalistic racial narrative so much, because that is some racist shit to have played there. But of course, we know the FBI guys are racist.
Yeah. That was I thought it was very wittily done, but very powerfully done too, and certainly I thought drove home the idea of the power of music.
Yeah,
and as if so here's a kind of music that the audience might not be familiar with. I mean, given all the innovations that Sun Ra was doing, but here's what this music is doing, and it's like, okay, do you not quite get what music can do? Well, I'll bet you recognize this. Do you understand what this music is doing? The power of music for evil, and so I thought that was very, very succinctly, powerfully done.
I think what's interesting is clearly music is another aspect of this, right? That's really important, because there's so much music in it. But the message of the power of music, right, is presented very explicitly on a number of points. Like even the beginning of one of the beginning scenes of the movie, when the overseer is mad at Sun Ra because Sun Ra is playing really cacophonous kind of music. He's playing chords that don't necessarily mesh with the ragtime sort of dance tune that he's supposed to be playing, and he's sort of being very disruptive. And when he finds out that the overseer wants him thrown out, his response is to play this wall of just impossible to comprehend sound that blows everybody out of the club except the overseer. And that's the moment when they start to have their conversation, on their like odd table in the desert, and start doing their bets. But like music at multiple points throughout this is presented as a thing that can have enormous power, not just physical but also mental power, right? The Dixie is meant to be something to be almost like a threat, the idea of music as a threat, or even the moment when Sun Ra goes to his concert at the end when he's almost assassinated, but he's offering a thing where like, I reject your reality, I believe in something higher and greater than this thing that you are offering. That's all presented through music again, and music, even some of the song, there's great almost like ditties in this, which I was not expecting coming back to this, when he's having the employment agency scene, and it's if Earth is boring, if the same old same thing, that was like the lyrics of this song, which I love that it's basically a jingle. It's basically an advertising jingle, but with jazz chords and some other things kind of going on. So music is naturally, obviously, very important because it's Sun Ra, but also has explicit moments of power throughout the film.
Well, and that thesis is established right from the start, right? When he says, how do we get the people to this planet? Through
music.
What the various different types of powers, and then deciding on music as the way to teleport them there.
Yeah, I love it. It's just such an interesting and unusual idea. I mean, this goes, I think, some of the stuff I was reading about Sun Ra, like to this idea that he, in developing the music that he eventually became known for, one of the things that he was doing was trying to think of music that could have a measurable impact or change on the world. And whether or not Sun Ra changed the world, I can't speak to that with any authority. He certainly has an influence on jazz music, but it's interesting that is clearly a thing that he is thinking about and comes across in the dialogue that he essentially wrote for himself in this film. That music is a thing that can save lives, that can change, can do things greater than we give it credit for.
I would be remiss if I didn't mention how much I enjoyed the variations on the tarot deck that we encounter in the desert duel scenes. I mean, some really clever stuff with the chariot, and that was certainly one of the early moments where the film was really having, it's like, okay, there's some really, really sharp stuff happening here, and I can't wait to see where this goes.
Yeah, the tarot deck scene, I mean, there's a lot of interesting detail given to some of the shot choices and scenery being presented. That, I think, was one of the more visually striking, is this like odd card table in the middle of a desert with the tarot cards and the line of there's an official word for that, but basically like beads that they're using to count, but I can't remember what that's really called, that counting thing.
Yeah, a bit like an abacus, but I don't know if that's what that was.
Yeah, it's something in that vein, though, right? Like it.
But
yeah. I mean, what's interesting is like clearly there's like biblical references being made here, but there's also this element of clearly this film is trying to get us to think about the different ways that people are embedded in power structures that exploit their own people, because the overseer, right, is a person that he literally wanders around town kind of coming across like a charity guy. Like he's a nice guy. He's doing right by the community. He plays with those youths at one point and kind of does a little, I guess, like they're flipping coins to see who wins. Or no, they're like trying to hit the cigarette butt or something. Some sort of game. And then like he comes across as like, I'm supposed to be a really nice guy. But we know for a fact that he works for the power structure, the thing one of the youths actually says, the like Eurasian Occidental Conspiracy or something to that effect. And then there's, Jimmy Fay, who again comes across as like he means well, he's trying to do the right thing, but he's been co-opted, right? He has been sucked into this power structure, and he works in the entertainment industry and mass media and has become part of the status quo that is sort of maintaining these things. And I think that the film is very clearly trying to pit that status quo maintaining side versus Sun Ra, this figure who is meant to be avant-garde, who's pushing the boundaries and violating the so-called rules, which includes the music scenes we were just talking about, where explicit rules of what we think of as pleasant music are violated left and right, but also in terms of the mission that he has offered, right? When he's offering the jobs, I want to talk about the employment agency. Can we talk about the outer space employment agency? Because it's so great, right? He's offering these jobs, but they don't offer salaries.
No.
There's even a moment when one of the beggars comes and is like, yeah. And he's like, what do you do? And he's like, oh, I do nothing. And Sun Ra's response is, oh, great. You're like an expert in nothing. He says, yeah, that's basically me. It's like, cool. We'll get you to do that. You can work for us and do nothing. And the guy's like, well, cool. How much do I get paid? Nothing. and there's a bit of irony at work there of like that what is being offered to all of the people that go on this journey it's none of the capitalistic expectations of like, these are real jobs that will help you make a living, right? There's the white guy who shows up at one point and is basically told that like, we don't pay salaries, so it doesn't help him to deal with the fact that he's got a wife and 7 kids, although he may be lying and be working for the fuzz. So there's all this interesting stuff about the contradictions between what Sun Ra is versus not a contradiction so much as a contrast between Sun Ra, this figure, versus the power structure of U.S. society in the 1970s.
Well, and to come back to the point you made about Jimmy Fay and the Overseer, calling him the Overseer, that's very loaded.
Yep.
So oh gee, what power structure is he representing there?
Yep.
And with Jimmy Fay, so then Terrell, his white suit suddenly takes on a kind of certain a added symbolism there. But Jimmy Fay, a very divided figure, which I perhaps makes sense with leading up to the final division that we see, right? Because he is, of all the characters, the one who was caught the most between the Overseer and Sun Ra, in that he is following the Overseer's orders, while at the same time does seem to be doing his best to get Sun Ra's message to the masses, right? And put on the concert and things like that. And so we see this, a very strong tension in who he is until finally Sun Ra physically divides him, or literally divides him, perhaps I should say, at the end of the film.
Yeah, and I was thinking too, there's these interesting sequences when 2 of these sex workers, who happen to also be nurses. Yeah, there's a whole thing with the nurses being sex workers thing in this. When the Overseer brings him in for the first time after Jimmy Fay, his first interaction with Sun Ra is he puts on this space helmet to communicate with Sun Ra, and it like puts him in almost like a coma kind of. And it's a whole to-do with when Sun Ra first lands, like it's a thing that's on the news, it's expected. And when he goes to the Overseer meets him in the hospital and wakes him up, the Overseer then coaxes the 2 nurses to strip, and the whole time Jimmy Fay is thinking, oh, I'm going to get to have some fun times right now. And then the Overseer kicks him out. And this happens multiple times in the movie. And so I think it's interesting to raise that betweenness, that the Overseer is making it also very clear of like, you are not in the same space as me. And so he is very trapped because on the one hand, he is trying to be part of these 2 spaces, but isn't fully in either of them because of how he has been co-opted and been used. He's a really fascinating character.
And I think here, too, though, we also have to acknowledge that there is an issue in that none of the women characters in the film really are, the only ones that we encounter are sex workers.
Yeah.
I think we get, certainly as far as anyone who has any lines, I think there's a couple of young women in the community hall where Sun Ra shows up, but in terms of actual characters in the film, it's very, very much a male space that we are navigating here.
Yeah, I mean, you're right, completely right. And I wonder if some aspect of this, because almost all of the men in this are presented as people dealing with some sort of community issue, right? There is the pimp who's a drug addict. There's Jimmy Fay who's trapped in these worlds. There's, these youths who clearly have nothing else to do and like rob a drunk. There's the drunk, like all these people that are dealing with mental health and other kinds of issues. I wonder if that's also what this film is trying to do, is to suggest that, the path that so many women are going into is prostitution. And let's be fair, that this film is not trying to suggest that sex workers is an A-OK profession. Whatever we may personally think about that now, this film is trying to suggest that this is not an appropriate path for women. But because everybody in this film who is not Sun Ra is presented as somebody who is in some sort of moral failing or some sort of situation that is bad for them, maybe that's also partly what's going on here. I don't think if that's the case, it doesn't quite work perfectly. But I think because we're also thinking about this in terms of like, wouldn't it be nice if we had like a female character who maybe was more like Jimmy Fay?
Well, that's the thing. I mean, I think there may be an element of what you were just saying there, but also when you rattle off all those other examples of different types of problems that other people are dealing with. But all of those, they're exclusively male characters, right?
Yeah.
There's only one kind of problem that we see female characters have.
Yeah, you're right. You're completely right.
I mean, so granting that, while still very much admiring what the film does.
Yeah, and look, let's be honest, we're about to close this show. There is a lot more we have not talked about. And some of it we barely talked about. If you are at all interested in learning more about this film, you can go watch it. There is a version that's on YouTube. It is, let's be fair, not technically legal, but if you want to watch it legally, you need to get the Criterion subscription service. If it's still there, I think it's off at the time of this recording. Otherwise, you need to go hunt down a DVD on eBay, which is what I did, if you want to be extra legal. The other thing you can also do is I do strongly recommend William Seitz' Sun Ra's Chicago, which is a book about, really it's like a biography of Sun Ra's life that goes into a lot of interesting depth about his relationship to the city of Chicago, his development of his music. There's an extraordinary amount of detail, which we did not talk about in this because we were talking about one of the movies. But it does talk about this film for about 15 pages, in addition to his music, etc. And also a number of his albums are on Spotify. If you want to hear some of Sun Ra's music, there are a lot of albums. And so take your pick, try them out. If you didn't like one, try a different one, because his music goes through a lot of different stylings and changes over the decades he was producing. He is no longer with us. He died in the 1990s, which is, unfortunate, but such is life. You get old, and sometimes then you just run out of years. So, well, all right, David, are we ready to start this process of closing out?
I guess so. So I just want to, again, thanks for bringing this movie to the show. That was it was a very exciting discovery for me. I really, really enjoyed that. And boy, talk about a film that will reward multiple viewings. So thanks again.
Well, I will tell you what, this is my second time seeing it. Totally worth it. It's an experience.
I can believe it.
It's an experience. Well, all right, folks, that's it for today. So if you'd like to let us know again what you thought about this episode, or you have any additions, things you want to add in, please head over to skiffyfanny.com/listener suggestions. Before we close out proper, it is time for David to tell us what we will watch next, because it is David's choice next.
Well, we're going to be turning to a film that in some ways about as far removed from this one as would be possible to get, but that I do think also speaks pretty cogently to our time, even though it's from 1969. This is The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie, for which Maggie Smith won herself an Oscar.
The Maggie Smith.
The Maggie Smith.
McGonagall Maggie Smith.
That's the one. Yeah.
I am stoked. That's going to be awesome.
This is her... Well, to steal her line from the film, this is her in her prime. So look out.
Awesome. All right. Well, stay tuned for that, everybody. We will be back, I don't know, in a few months, because that's about the schedule for this particular show. So, as always, make sure to follow us on Skiffy and Fanty on Twitter and Instagram. Subscribe to the newsletter at skiffyandfanty.com/newsletter. And if you like what we do, we would really, really love it if you support us on Patreon at patreon.com/skiffyandfanty. David and I are currently doing writing sprints on Tuesdays and Thursdays at 10 a.m. Central Time. And I'm happy to do other times if folks would like to participate. So please get on there. Every little bit does help. It helps us cover hosting and occasionally buying someone a mic when a monkey destroys it and those kinds of things. And the other thing that you can do to really help us is, if you haven't already, a 5-star review on iTunes, and also tell your friends about the show. We got to get more listeners so that we can take over the world. And as for me, you can find me at Sean Duke on Twitter, seanduke.net, or patreon.com/thejoyfactory.
And you can find me at David_Annandale on Twitter, and davidannandale.com for what passes for my blog.
Yep, and go buy all of David's books.
Yeah, please, all of them.
Yeah, I mean, let me rephrase that. Go buy at least some of the books now, and then eventually buy all of them, because I'm pretty sure the amount of books that David has released, you would go broke.
No, just buy all of them now.
Okay, got it. Yeah, just buy all of them. You heard David. Yeah, screw your bank account. All right, folks. Well, on that note, I need to make it awkward, so I will just note that I have been gently brushing my cat to get all of the fur, because it is hot here, and so he's shedding, and I think I'm going to knit a very cute little tie for David.
Okay, yeah, that's not awkward at all. And scene.
Awkward and again, scene. If you want to support this show, you can go to patreon.com/skiffyandfanty or skiffyandfanty.com, our website, where you can get access to all of our fancy things. Our music comes from Holy Mole. You can support him and his work at patreon.com/holymole. Thank you for listening.